understand Saturn in Gemini. First, let's understand Saturn. Saturn is the planet that symbolizes negativity. And what does negativity mean? Really, negativity is best represented by the minus sign. What does a minus sign do? It makes things decrease. And that is what Saturn represents. The decrease. And that's why Saturn signifies everything connected with reduction and diminishing. And that is why we think of it as a planet of failure or bad luck. Because generally we associate plus with positive, with profit, etc., and negative with bad, failure. Though it is not necessarily a bad planet when you apply it to certain things. For example, if you can get less angry, if you can get less frustrated, if you can get less cancer, then having less is better than having more. So don't have the wrong idea that Saturn is necessarily bad, but do understand that it is reductive and restrictive. So this is also why Saturn is not considered the planet of profit, but it's a planet of deficit or scarcity. And that's why it's associated with poverty and neediness. Also, it's the planet for destruction, because destruction is how you get rid of things and reduce things. Or instead of destroying it outright, you can restrict it or hold it down. And that's planet's nature. It's very strict. It's very confining. It's very restrictive of things so that they don't grow. Riffing on the theme of destruction, this is also why Saturn is the planet of death. Death is another word for destruction. But this also brings out other things about Saturn. The things which lead to death are also in Saturn's portfolio of what it symbolizes. So old age is an important thing symbolized by Saturn. Decay, or the state of not being shiny and crisp and new. And illness. Those are all Saturn's symbolisms. And hence, because it's the planet of death, it's actually also the planet of lifespan or longevity. How long until it's over. And so Saturn has to do with endurance and tenacity, and perseverance. Now, destruction is an aspect of decrease, and then things like death and so forth are an aspect of destruction. Another aspect of decrease is restriction. So now let's explore that. Restriction means holding things down. So Saturn represents subordinating things, making things inferior or curbing them down or holding them down. And hence, Saturn represents people who are held down, who are subordinate. So all the types of people who, like the proletariat, the run-of-the-mill average person, the employee, not the boss, the slave, not the master, the servant. And so therefore Saturn represents the general person, the masses. One other thing about negativity, we have to go all the way back up to the root symbol of Saturn to finish understanding everything that it symbolizes. Negativity doesn't just mean decrease, but it also means a negative attitude or pessimism. And of course it's related, because when your pessimism means looking for the thing that you should subtract, looking for the thing that you should take away. So Saturn is definitely the pessimistic planet, and that's why it is not a trusting or faithy planet. It's not a believey planet. It's a distrusting, skeptical planet. This is why it signifies critique, our ability to analyze things, critique things, figure out what's not right. And that's why Saturn is very, very logical, methodical, and scientific. And finally, related to this, in order to be critical, logical, scientific about how you're assessing things, you have to be dispassionate about them. You have to be unattached to them. So Saturn is the planet of objectivity, dispassion, detachment. And it's associated, therefore, not with how we feel about stuff or subjectivity, but how the stuff actually is. So it's a very objective or realistic, practical planet. Now you know what I think you need to know about Saturn. We should now figure out what we need to know about Gemini. Essentially, what Gemini signifies is intellect, because it's an air sign, which is intelligent, has to do with communication, and it's ruled by the planet Mercury, who signifies the intellect and communication. So Gemini's basic underlying theme is intellect. And intellect has two aspects that we can organize everything else about Gemini around. Intellect is the ability to solve problems, and intellect is the ability to interact with things. So, on the theme of solving problems, Gemini is extremely important for our ability to perceive things, our perceptivity, our alertness, our awakeness. Perception is the first step in solution. You have to be able to perceive things effectively, perceive things clearly before you can figure out what you should do with them. Second thing is invention. Gemini is a very inventive sign because that's the part where you're figuring out what to do with the stuff that you've perceived. What is possible with this stuff? What can I do with this stuff? And then the third aspect of solution is organization. How should I arrange these things so that they're optimal? How should I arrange these things so that they do what I want? So Gemini is organizational, orders things in the right way, likes the things go in a certain pattern. On the other side of intellect is about interaction, the ability. And so interaction is the key aspect of what Gemini is all about. And in other words, that means communication. Interaction is basically communication. A corollary thing about Gemini that doesn't exactly fit anywhere else on the chart is that Gemini is therefore very, very balanced or equal. It gives and takes. It takes in and it puts out. It listens and it expresses. So it's very balanced and it's very equalized, and it's also not heavy on one side. So Gemini is quite flexible. It can adjust to any equilibrium that needs to be maintained. That's the nature of Gemini, and that falls under this umbrella of it being communicative or interactive. Something more obvious is that it's cooperative. Interaction means cooperating with things. So Gemini is very good for partnerships, cooperations, and diplomacy type of stuff that goes along with that. It's also very friendly because air is kind of pleasant. It's the pleasant element in the zodiac. So Gemini is particularly relevant to the friendly type of cooperation. And therefore Gemini has a sense of being playful or relaxed or fun or witty. And finally, the other sense of interaction is commerce, exchange, the ability to exchange things, the ability to buy and sell, the ability to trade. Good stuff. Now we understand what Gemini really is, and we understand what Saturn really is, and now we are going to talk about Saturn in Gemini. When you put a planet in a sign, the way that you figure out the interpretation is that you look for things which would resonate with each other because they're on the same page. So right away something comes to mind is that Saturn has to do with logic, science, and Gemini has to do with intellect. So when Saturn is in Gemini, the implication is that the person's intellect functions pretty scientifically. In other words, they're kind of an analytical thinker, a critical thinker. They're not very belief-oriented or faith-oriented. They will really prefer worldviews and explanations which are simple, practical, real, and demonstrable. Another thing that should pop to mind really fast is that Saturn is quite a cold planet. It's detached, it's emotionally cold, and it's not very fun. It's pretty serious. Whereas the whole flavor of Gemini is very friendly and kind of light and warm. So there's a clash between the detachment of Saturn and the friendliness of Gemini, which is why Saturn in Gemini indicates people who are pretty much loners. They have a particular attitude towards friends, which is that friends are kind of annoying. Friends are kind of a burden. They're work. Another thing about Saturn and Gemini is that Saturn is a rigid planet and Gemini is a flexible sign. And this is why we interpret Saturn and Gemini to indicate a person who, first of all, isn't particularly flexible physically. They probably have a stiff posture, or they probably move in a stiff way. They're also inflexible intellectually or emotionally, so they could be described as stubborn. And they're also inflexible in how they go about their activities. So they have schedules, they like schedules. They don't like spontaneity. They don't operate well with spontaneous events. They like things to be scheduled and they want to stick to the schedule, and they get frustrated when they can't do things on the schedule. And finally, Saturn is a withdrawn planet, but Gemini is the expressive sign. Saturn is withdrawn because it's objective and it's detached. So it's not interacting with things. But Gemini is all about interactive and expressive. This is why we interpret Saturn in Gemini to indicate a person who has a little trouble communicating. So they may be stuttering, or they may just be shy, or they just may be reluctant to express themselves. That is Saturn in Gemini on paper, and in a vacuum, in a void. That's what Saturn in Gemini means. We should now take a look at some people that have Saturn in Gemini, so that we can get more than just a theoretical understanding of it. So some well-known people are Eminem, Billie Eilish, and Jim Morrison, Paul McCartney, Jimi Hendrix, etc. Most of the famous 1960s wave of musicians was born when Saturn was in Gemini. So just focusing on these names that I have on here, I think you can really actually see a Saturn in Gemini trait in the sort of negativity or darkness in the way they express themselves. However, you'll see something interesting. The withdrawn versus expressive clash also makes a person seek out a way to express themselves because they don't feel comfortable expressing themselves in the conventional way, in straightforward, regular conversation. So Saturn in Gemini will push a person towards writing, or towards poetry, or towards music, or art, or some other way of expressing themselves. And so we do find plenty of authors with Saturn in Gemini. Not just the musicians. Arthur Rimbaud, Oscar Wilde, Orson Welles, George Lucas, Sacha Cohen, Borat. Then we have Elon Musk. Of course, you'll think he's very wealthy, he's very entrepreneurial. That's not necessarily coming from Saturn in Gemini. But you see his difficulty expressing himself. He's on the autism spectrum, I believe. There's a difficulty expressing himself, communicating, etc. Joe Biden, he's a stutterer. He's also pretty, not very party. You don't think partyish or friendly or fun when you think of Joe Biden. That is also quite illustrative of Saturn in Gemini. Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, Saturn in Gemini. Sigmund Freud and Copernicus, two big scientists. So these are names. The important thing would be to look at the charts behind these names. Let's pick out 3 and look at those charts so that we can see what Saturn in Gemini is like in real cases, not in a vacuum. So the first one I'd like to look at is Copernicus. So he particularly brought out the aspect of logic and intellect. When Saturn, the planet of logic, is in Gemini, the planet of intellect, and you probably get a scientist. You probably get a person who thinks very rationally and likes things to be empirically verifiable. So why is it that Copernicus is on the list, but so is Eminem, and Eminem is not like a scientist? Well, in Copernicus's chart, the thing that is really important to notice is that he has Mercury at 18 degrees of Pisces and Saturn at 19 degrees of Gemini, and that makes them perfectly square to each other. This puts Mercury and Saturn's perfect square, because Saturn has a perfect square aspect on the 10th house. And it puts Saturn in Mercury's three-fourths perfect square, because Mercury has a 75% aspect on the 4th house. So it puts them in mutual aspect. So Saturn is in mutual aspect with Mercury. This is going to bring out the intellectual facet of Saturn in Gemini. Additionally, Saturn is in a mutual aspect with Jupiter. So that's also going to bring out the wisdom-seeking nature of Saturn in Gemini. And that's why Copernicus illustrates the scientific potential of Saturn in Gemini. Not to mention that simple things like his rising sign is Virgo. How about Joe Biden now? Taking a look at this chart. Another little interesting side note is Copernicus has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 houses occupied by real planets, which makes him interested in the arts and sciences. Joe Biden has 1, 2, 3, 4 signs occupied, which makes him more practical. And this is why Joe Biden's flavor is very practical. He's a practical guy. He's not flashy. He's not particularly interesting or exciting. He's just boring, but probably gets jobs done. That's one of the effects of having 4 houses occupied. Joe Biden's Saturn in Gemini affects the ascendant directly. I've found that this is the case in most people who have stutter. It's not just Saturn in Gemini which brings out stutter, but it's the effect on the ascendant. Or it could also have to do with affecting other key points like the second lord. Joe Biden's case, Saturn is the second lord. So that is also the case there, because the second house is for speech. He also has Mercury in the 12th house with the 12th lord and combusts. So the speech thing is having a hard time getting out when it's in the 12th house. And just he has the first lord exalted and he has the moon exalted. So this is why he's an exemplary person. He's an extremely successful person. The first lord and the moon are the 2 most important planets. He has those exalted. Now, Mussolini is the third chart I want to look at. It's not that Saturn in Gemini makes you a violent dictator. But if you have Saturn in Gemini in the 8th house flanking the 9th lord moon with Mars exactly on the other side, then it might lead you to be very unfriendly, which is certainly in the potential of Saturn in Gemini. Unfriendly, stubborn. He doesn't particularly... Mussolini did not really have a problem expressing himself. He was a powerful orator. Well, sure enough, his Jupiter is exalted. Now you can say, well, so is Joe Biden's. But Mussolini's Jupiter is his second lord. So it affects his speech. Mussolini, if you count the houses that he has occupied, there's 3. So this is an interesting 3 charts to look at. Mussolini has 3 occupied, Biden has 4, and Copernicus has 5. And they really illustrate these principles. 3 makes you a fighter, 4 makes you a worker, and 5 makes you an artist. So I hope you enjoyed that review of the theory of Saturn in Gemini and then put into practice in real charts. If you want to see your planets and your signs analyzed in this way, in my system, then you can go to my website, victorcara.com, and you can go to the reports page, the readings, and you can order the guided tour of your birth chart or the birth chart overview. And that will explain to you all of your planets in all of your signs, houses, etc. Thank you very much.